Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. Death sucks. Nothing but the most enlightened of takes on this show, I know. But it does. It's the one thing that none of us can beat. At the end of all things is death. Be it soon or later, it comes for all. Nothing stops its approach, be it quick and painless, or slow and painful. It is the one inevitability all of mankind shares. But hey, look on the bright side. You only gotta do it once. Be thankful you're not the poor bastard in this story. Resurrection Man is a 28-issue series published by DC, Take a Shot, written by sci-fi legend Dan Abnett alongside Andy Lanning, with Butch Guice on art and Carla Feeney doing colors. Our story centers around Mitch Shelley, a homeless vagrant with no memory of his past who, in the midst of a major crisis, discovers he has the miraculous superhuman ability to fly, only to be immediately torn to shreds in a hail of gunfire. As his life flashes before his eyes, Mitch suddenly reawakens no worse for wear. With a new lease on life, and new power to boot, Mitch quickly finds himself hunted for reasons unknown, setting out across America under the moniker of Resurrection Man, aiding those in need whenever he can with his miraculous ability to rise from the dead no matter how badly he's hurt, every time gaining a totally new superpower. First and foremost, I want to say that I adore this premise. It is rife for exploration, and the fairly modular nature of the character makes the storytelling easy. The troubled drifter dealing with a crisis is very reminiscent of the old Incredible Hulk show, where Banner ends up in some bizarre crisis and has to solve it each week, same for Mitch. Although instead of trying to find some increasingly contrived excuse for Banner to Hulk out, it's finding new and interesting ways to get Mitch killed so his powers become what works best for the plot. It definitely works in a very serialized format, free from a very heavy narrative where you can just jump in wherever. And the concept of new powers manifesting over old ones each story harkens back to works like Dial H for Hero, albeit far more macabre. As for Mitch himself, I rather quite like him, although he's not all that interesting. He's very much a hero of the era, a good guy with a sarcastic edge with not a whole lot of depth to him. He has a very ordinary backstory, at least for comic books, a crooked lawyer who got in with the mob, wanted out and got backstabbed for it, which informs his personality well. He works as a good center point for everything that goes on, looking to make amends for his past misdeeds, but not going for the standard tortured soul angle. The amnesia arc he goes through is handled alright. It's short enough to not be obtrusive, but at the same time never really informs Mitch as a character, or adds much to the overarching narrative. Thankfully, it's resolved pretty quickly. The way he got his powers, though, isn't incorporated very well into his origin, being almost entirely disconnected from his life as a lawyer and his redemption, although I do like the speculative sci-fi angle they end up going with. Much of the recurring supporting cast isn't all that interesting, though. Predominantly is this woman, Kim, a private investigator who becomes embroiled in Mitch's problems after mistakenly believing his disappearance was insurance fraud. She's a decent character, I like her banter with Mitch and she plays off him well, but as a foil doesn't quite work as after the initial shock of things is largely similar to Mitch personality-wise. That being said, I do like how quickly she adapts to things and takes the crazy shenanigans in stride. There's also a sparse amount of overarching antagonists. The primary enemy of Resurrection Man is the mysterious organization known as The Lab, whose experiments granted Mitch his powers and would very much like to have them back. Within the first 12 issues, we don't learn all that much about them, and while intriguing as an overarching metaplot, they don't get enough focus to really matter, and it's a bit weird that they're just some non-specific super science outfit with no real greater ties to the DC universe. Mitch primarily squares off against the Body Doubles, a pair of bounty hunters hired to take him in. I found them to be really forgettable and annoying, generic comedy duo mercs with no real personalities who are really only around for two main reasons. There's also the enigmatic and unfortunately named Hooker, something of an evil counterpart to Mitch, possessing the same inability to die, but without the cool extra benefits, who's on a blood hunt to kill Mitch and steal his powers. I also didn't really like Hooker. He's a bland, wacky and crazy psycho killer who rambles incessantly, lacking any real depth at all, and the consequences of a mirror version of Mitch is hardly dealt with at all. And his origin, while compelling, feels haphazardly tacked on and is delivered very clumsily. Also, despite explicitly having no powers beyond regeneration, he's somehow got superhuman strength and agility, which just kinda seems silly. Honestly, when he first showed up, I just thought he was gonna be a goddamn vampire, which would have been way fucking cooler. The setting, Abnett, and landing build is certainly very intriguing, kept fairly realistic with the only abnormal elements being Mitch's special abilities. Unfortunately, this is hampered by a key component, that being the setting's connection to the greater DC universe. It's an issue I've had dozens of times before with these shorter, more realistic sci-fi books, for example Hacker Files, which I reviewed prior, where the abnormal and supernatural elements feel weakened by the greater context of the setting. Mitch being this mythical immortal with a roulette of abilities, wandering around the country and rising from the dead to help those in need, is presented as mysterious and special within the narrative, but in a greater scope is just not all that interesting when in a universe where, well, let's just face it, most things just aren't that special in a world where fucking Superman exists. It would be fine if they were just kept in the background, the occasional cameo in the distance or an offhand remark, but Mitch and company consistently find their paths crossing with the heavy hitters of the universe, almost immediately with the second issue having Mitch haphazardly stumbling into a brawl between the Justice League and Amazo. The standard superheroic exploits just feel at odds with the series and distracts from the narrative, and I wish they downplayed this aspect more. That being said, I did really enjoy issue 7, told through the perspective of Batman going through an average day in Gotham, where he keeps crossing paths with Mitch, who keeps ending up as an unfortunate recipient of Gotham's usual hospitality. But they're ultimately distracting to have around, especially with an early issue tying into forgotten event Genesis, where the body doubles randomly end up on Apocalypse because shenanigans. A bland, uninteresting issue with no real coherent through line. Although I do enjoy the Kirby-esque artistic choices taken here. The only other crossover to the wider DC universe, though, is the one with the absolute most fitting choice to make. I was sitting there, reading it, thinking to myself, you know who would be the best character for Mitch to meet? Tommy Monahan from Hitman. And sure enough, he does exactly that in issues 9 and 10. Hired by the Falcones to kill Mitch, due to running afoul of them early on, Tommy is the most logical foil for him. After all, when you've got a guy with superpowers making a mess of your schemes, who better else to hire than the de facto specialist in assassinating supers? Abnett really captures Tommy's personality exactly as how Ennis wrote him, a casual disregard for his situation with a thin veneer of smart-ass edginess, but self-aware enough to know when to drop the act and run screaming. It also gives a decent excuse for the obligatory crossover fight, and still remains in character for Tommy to eventually make friends. And the sequence where Tommy helps Mitch recover his memory with his telepathy is nice. It's one of those things Tommy barely ever does, and the way it's presented both narratively and artistically is fantastic. It is far too narratively convenient that Tommy just so happens to know exactly the guys who gave Mitch his powers, and exactly where they're at. But considering the types of shit he gets up to, it's not unbelievable that he'd know. And it gets made up for with this sequence of Tommy repeatedly killing Mitch over and over again so he'll get an actually useful superpower for once. A sequence I had been waiting for since the initial premise got set up. The art in the series is a solid fit too, a nice contrast between abstract cartoony and rigid realism. I enjoy the sharp, uneven line work and the thick, blocky shadowing, intricate detailing work with thin lining, albeit not perfect as there is some rather loose grasp on an anatomical structure. The muted color palette does provide a nice contrast from the fantastical elements, but oftentimes the gradienting for skin tones can seem sloppy. Overall, it reminds me a lot of John Buscema's art from the era. Not nearly as deranged, but a similar vibe. Overall, Resurrection Man is a nice break from the usual offerings. A fun, serialized concept utilized well, but generally dragged down when the overarching story arcs take focus over the episodic exploits. It's a concept that would honestly work better as a TV show rather than a comic, but gets a solid recommendation for me nonetheless. Having taken a peek at some of the issues beyond where I intended to stop, I can see that there's a little more incorporation of some more of the lower tier elements of the DC universe, and I think they work incorporate better well than having the Justice League and all the big heavy hitters in, but it still feels a little at odds with the setup that we've had. DC briefly revived the Resurrection Man, no pun intended, for the New 52, bringing Abnett and Lanning back to right, and I've heard good things about that version too. And we're gonna hitch a ride with Abnett from America over to the UK, deep into the pages of the world-renowned anthology book 2000 AD. No, we're not looking at Judge Dredd, yet. Instead, we're taking a look at another character that once called the book his home, with a still rather sizable fan base despite his lengthy absence. That being the mighty, demented exploits of Nemesis the Warlock. First debuting in issue 167 of 2000 AD, dated July 1980, the Nemesis subseries was created by Pat Mills and Kevin O'Neill, who wrote and drew the adventures respectively. The story of Nemesis is divided into 10 distinct books, each covering a different chapter of the story, and compiled across 3 collected volumes. I'll be focusing on the first volume, covering books 1 through 4, which also feature additional art by Jesus Redondo and Brian Talbot. Talbot? I don't know. The first 2 stories, initially released under a subline called Comic Rock, a series of stories inspired by contemporary rock songs. While they serve to introduce the cast and setting, the overall tone and characterization differs, depicting a much more comedic and overtly satirical story than the serious space fantasy that comes out after. It is the far-flung future, and mankind has crawled back from the grasp of extinction. After centuries of cataclysm at the hands of alien invaders, the human race has clawed its way back to the top, conquering the galaxy under the banner of the Termite Empire. Dedicating themselves to the purity of humanity, the Empire has spread out across the galaxy in an effort to exterminate the deviant aliens and mutants that inhabit it. With their seat of power being the former Earth, now rechristened Termite, the planet has become a sprawling technological nightmare. Sprawling tunnels and roadways woven across and through the planet and littered with highly advanced cities and architectural marvels. The planet is an interstellar freeway for the mighty Empire to base itself from. But not everyone agrees with the Empire's ideals, and the mighty Terminators that enforce the laws. And Termite is opposed by the Credo, a rebel alliance who extend a welcome hand to any and all throughout the galaxy, regardless of origin. Fighting for the group's sake is their great leader, the enigmatic Nemesis. A mighty alien warlock, Nemesis carves a path throughout Termite and beyond each and every day, doing battle with the Empire forces and the sinister spectral Torquemada, Grand Inquisitor and almighty ruler of the Empire. If any of this looks or sounds familiar to you, it's because it is. Don't mistake my wording though. I'm not saying Nemesis ripped off 40k. I'm saying 40k ripped off Nemesis. Like, a lot. Like, a whole lot. More than I can really point out, actually. But enough about that, let's talk about the story. There's not much of an overarching cast. A few characters pop up from book to book, but with the exception of Nemesis and Torquemada, each story arc in each book features a new setting and cast. I like this, it gives a lot of variety to the visuals and locales, and each new planet allows for a new bit of culture and fleshing out the galaxy. Many of the aliens we see are bizarre, surreal creatures, some borrowed from existing ideas and others created wholesale. Each and every one feels unique, and rarely falls into the planet of blank problem a lot of sci-fi settings do with their aliens. Nemesis himself is an intriguing protagonist. He's a good example of good does not mean nice. While he fights for peace and unity galaxy-wide, he's a violent, cruel warlord with a spiteful streak a parsec wide. He's willing to play by the rules insofar as they're convenient to him, and breaking them as he sees fit. His demonic form isn't just for looks, and Nemesis is a very Faustian character, prone to gruesome tricks and mischievous one-sided bargains to get his way, often preying on his foe's own desires and insecurities to get what he wants. He's not honorless, he'll never force anyone to help him unwillingly, or at least without good incentive, and he'll uphold any deal he may have made. He'll just stack the deck in his favor and won't elaborate on the finer details. The only real inconsistency with his character from book to book is his feelings on humanity. In some books, he'll outright despise humans and will slaughter them without remorse or care, and other times he'll have a soft spot for them and does ultimately want peace and unity with them and the galaxy at wide. On the opposite spectrum of things is Nemesis' eternal, Nemesis, the almighty Torquemada. A crazed, bloodthirsty tyrant, he has one and only one goal: complete human dominance of the galaxy and eradication of the deviant filth that is extraterrestrial life. He is very much cut from the mold of the typical Inquisitor, dogmatically enforcing his tyrannical will and oppressive ideology from the far reaches of his army. While the comic rock stories portray him as a glorified traffic cop, a buffoonish ranter akin to a Saturday morning cartoon villain, this quickly gets set aside in the story proper, and Torquemada becomes a no-nonsense, wrathful monster, fueled by his eternal hatred. Not even death can stop him, transformed into a spectral wraith following an untimely death in the second comic rock story, and consistently escaping death battle after battle. Not that his mighty army of Terminators get the same courtesy. Nearly all of them are deranged zealots and consistently portrayed as either self-serving, incompetent, cowardly, backstabbing, or generally all-around unpleasant people. Even when they're presented as a serious threat, they generally fall face first into buffoonery one way or another, threatening in the long term, but never quite managing to be a significant threat to Nemesis at any given point in time, with only their overbearing numbers and weaponry giving him any challenge. Each book largely tells a single overarching story, with the first 3 books being somewhat serialized, comprised of shorter story arcs that feed into the greater plot. I particularly enjoy this approach as it allows for each book to have variety in its narrative without a segment feeling superfluous. However, this is hampered by the overall pacing issues each story segment tends to have. Due to the anthology format of 2000 AD, Nemesis only gets on average about 5 pages an issue, so each segment has to rush through events to make any significant progress in the overall narrative. While each segment does at least make some degree of progress and little wasted space, usually ended on a satisfying cliffhanger, it also leaves little space to breathe and fully reflect on the world at large, or the characters. While this might not be an issue for Nemesis or Torquemada, it does hinder much of the supporting characters book by book. The comic rock entries set up the basic conceit of the storyline, but are largely disconnected from the greater narrative. Establishing the Termite Empire and our 2 main players, the story is less serious and is more heavily rooted in the zany social satire that 2000 AD is best known for. Depicting Termite as an overdeveloped seething mass of tunnels, freeways, and congested traffic, where mankind is rooted on the roads, and the Inquisition being essentially superpowered traffic cops. Torquemada an overbearing but bumbling chief, and Nemesis as the rule-breaking bad boy who plows through the sprawling roads like a devil without care, laughing at the law and their feeble attempts to stop him. Nemesis and Torquemada are largely non-characters here. Hell, Nemesis only says a single thing the entire time, largely devoid of their later personalities or status. The way Termite is depicted is also incongruous with the remainder of the series, opting for a more standard sci-fi fare rather than the faux medieval techno-fantasy styling it would adopt. They're not terrible stories by any fashion, mind you. They're enjoyable one-shots that work entirely on their own, but there isn't much to say about them in the greater context. I do like the retro-futuristic aesthetic of these 2 stories. The envisioning of the future limited by the current era always fascinates me. It's a style that's hard to replicate. The second one shows Torquemada forced to take an ancient teleportation network, evoking old-school phone operators and telegraph networks, and the surreal, otherworldly visuals all are very fun. I like the casualization of this fantastical technology, the way even horrible life-ending accidents are treated as minor inconveniences, as facts of life. While their events are canon, they're largely unremarkable in the grand scheme of things, although not to the extent of being bad or worth skipping. The first book proper opens up with a few smaller arcs before leading into the primary story arc, re-establishing the setting by retconning the Termite Empire from the goofier depictions into a darker, more serious threat, wiping world after world clean of deviant alien life form, as well as reintroducing both Torquemada and Nemesis. Nemesis gets a proper introduction here, his demonic stature given a suitable story to be cast in. Crashing on a fringe colony world, Nemesis is captured by the humans living there, humiliated and seemingly killed before the citizens hang him up in triumph. Nemesis doesn't let this go lightly, and slowly begins inflicting curses upon the village for their crimes. It's a solidly spooky story, nice as a one-off that really helps to set the tone. It shows Nemesis as a vindictive but not unfair person, sparing the few who did him no harm, leaving with no further incident once released. Torquemada's return is comparatively brief, showing that the Inquisition quickly moved on without him and really are glad that asshole is dead. But fate has a funny way of sneaking up on you. The primary story of Book 1 deals with Nemesis staging a massive jailbreak. When the Inquisition discovers his organization's main resistance still on Termite, Nemesis must rush to rescue them before they're sentenced to death. For a debut story, it's sufficiently high stakes. Not cosmically vital, but not totally trivial either. It gives plenty of opportunity to show every facet of both Nemesis and Torquemada's personalities, their highly contrasted viewpoints balanced only by their equal devotion to their own cause, as well as their hatred for one another. We also get some nice fleshing out of the greater world, the advanced, unsettling technology of distant Earth on full display, contrasted with Nemesis' dark, archaic magics, provide a nice balance. The 2 leaders of the mighty forces have a chaotic and intense battle during the climax, Torquemada's assault unwavering and brutal, using his ghostly form to continuously take on new forms every time Nemesis slays him. Ultimately, Nemesis is able to once again outsmart his fiendish foe and pull out a victory for the rebellion, closing Book 1 with the promise that Torquemada is once again vanquished for good. As an opening chapter, it's solid, hefty world building and setting up of later elements in an unobtrusive way, such as a meeting with Nemesis' Uncle Ball, giving a brief glimpse into his people's culture and the overall views of the galaxy at large. While the plot is hardly much to talk about, it's at least exciting and gives plenty of variety, and solidly hooks the reader's attention. Book 2 picks up an indeterminate amount of time later, opening with a prologue delving into the terrible Torquemada's backstory. His betrayal by his own people who compromised their own teachings to sell him into alien slavery, having spearheaded his descent into the fanatical psychopath he is in present day. While hardly the most original of origins, it fits him well, perfectly explaining his motives and actions without making him seem sympathetic. The bulk of the story, however, focuses around the internal politics of the Credo movement. With their great leader gone, Nemesis and his forces have launched into overdrive, dismantling warfront after warfront as Terminator morale plummets. Unsurprisingly, however, Torquemada has again survived, and is already working on how to get his revenge. The book goes into more detail how the Resistance and the galaxy at large see humans, with Nemesis being seen as an outlier and a bit of a whack job for believing that humans are not inherently bad, and that with enough time they can be rehabilitated from their xenophobic ideologies and coexist among the galaxy. To that end, the story largely centers around Arachnos, the Resistance's prison world inhabited by giant fucking spiders, where Nemesis and the leader of the planet have an ongoing experiment to try and tame warriors of termite and get them to give up their hateful ways. Torquemada ain't having none of that, of course, and conspires with a group of recently captured Terminators to attempt to destabilize the experiment and make it seem a failure, trying to provoke Credo into an all-out war against termite. I like this arc a lot too. It sufficiently raises the stakes from the prior arc without needing to go overboard or introducing 100 new things. The world building is nice without needing to spend multiple issues worth of time on it, but the inner politicking of Credo isn't much dwelled on. I do really love the designs and aesthetic of Arachnos. I appreciate that they're just regular ass spiders but huge, and their architecture reflects that. Torquemada and his Terminators' escape from the prison colony is frantic and exciting, equally showing Torquemada's ability to think one step ahead, while also showing the general incompetence of his troops. As well, the actual conclusion of the arc is fairly rushed, with Nemesis uncovering the scheme basically immediately and rushing to stop his foe, and everything just gets wrapped up with no real fanfare. Book 2 definitely keeps up overall quality though, despite its missteps. Book 3 picks up sometime shortly after, with 2 different arcs, opening and closing the book with one, and the bulk consisting of another. Opening up with a short arc delving into Nemesis' own people, and fleshing out his character, as he returns home to reunite with his wife and celebrate the oncoming birth of their child. His culture, relationships, and overall standing amongst his people are quickly established without heavy exposition, saying much with very little. The primary setup is a conflict between Nemesis' wife and a rival, who wants to be Nemesis' bride instead, jealous of her wealth and power, leading to stoop to depths so vile as to betray her own people to the Terminators. From here, the primary story is much lower stakes compared to the previous 2, featuring Nemesis arriving on a distant world to aid their populace against an invasion from termite. The world nor the invaders are of any great importance in the grand scheme of the galaxy, but not so insignificant that it isn't worth the fight. A lot of this one is shown from the point of view of the invaders, largely dealing with the behind-the-scenes struggles the commander is forced to deal with, while also focusing on the technological aspects of termite. Utilizing massive war robots, built in ancient times before the fall of Earth and the rise of the Empire, the Terminators are largely forced to coerce and prod these machines into working, their functions and control long lost to them. This naturally causes headache after headache, especially since they're none too bright and tend to be a bit temperamental. But I enjoy this one nonetheless. It helps to humanize, no pun intended, the Terminators, showing the commander at his wits' end even bothering to conquer this planet. Frustrated with putting up with Torquemada's bullshit and having to micromanage everyone, not to mention the absolute failure of their warbots, as well as showing that not all Terminators necessarily fully agree with Termite's teachings. It still doesn't make them redeemable, thankfully. I do like how Nemesis gets the win, not through force of power, but instead trickery, striking a deal with the commander of the Terminators to turn on Torquemada. And I also really like the designs of the robot war machines. They're so vastly different that the technological aesthetic we've seen up to now, and it really highlights how they're out of their own time, ancient technology lost to the ages. Overall, the third book is a bit of a step down from the previous one in terms of content, but nonetheless enjoyable. It works as a fairly standalone story without needing much of the prior world building to enjoy. I won't spoil what happens to resolve the first storyline, but let's just say things don't have a happy ending in this book. The fourth and final book of the first volume, which was actually the very first written for Nemesis, but released later, takes another drastic change in tone and setting. Nemesis arrives on planet Britannia, home of the Goths, a chameleon-like race that has modeled themselves on 1920s Victorian London. Believing themselves to be as human as the Termite Empire, they have forged an alliance in name only, which the Empire has capitalized on to easily exterminate the Goths with ease. Nemesis has come to their world to convince their leaders to turn on Termite and join the Resistance, and arrives just in time too, as a secret society known as the Hellfire Club plot in the shadows. Striking a deal with a rapidly degenerating Torquemada, the club seeks to assassinate the planet's leaders and usurp power, falsely believing Termite will truly let them live in peace afterwards. Racing against time and his own reputation, Nemesis must uncover the club's schemes and save Britannia from not just Torquemada, but themselves as well. It's a major change of pace from the prior books, and it's absolutely wonderful. I love the gothic Victorian era aesthetic, and the exciting throwback to classic mystery adventure stories works shockingly well with Nemesis' character and the setting. The idea of alien culture models themselves on olden time Earth due to receiving outdated media is hardly anything new. Hell, Star Trek had done this exact plot twice, and that was over 20 years before, so the bit was already overplayed by now. So while it might not bring much new to the table, it's still really well written and packed full of twists and turns. It makes Nemesis rely on his intelligence and trickery rather than brute force, having to stay hidden from the populace who believe him a monster. I do like the way the Goths are set up and the way their planet looks. The retro-futurist vibe of the Victorian-style architecture, rigged up with rocket jets and high-tech equipment, is unique. That style of anachronistic technology or architecture is something that always really interests me, and this part more than the others utilizes it to its fullest. Not to say the artwork and designs throughout the whole series don't. The series has a consistent vibe of blending clashing elements to a unique and satisfying style, with the Empire having a similar vibe of futuristic medieval knights, with starships in the form of grand cathedrals, the Terminators dressed in bizarro versions of ancient armors. There's almost a blending of organic and mechanical, with the Terminators, Torquemada, and even Nemesis himself having armor clad with heavy plating and tubeworks, thin, sinewy strands of metal resembling stretched musculature, and ghastly masks shaped like faces from deep nightmares. It's equally terrifying and intriguing to look at, leaving a lasting impression, yet still a struggle to comprehend, but not in a bad way, a nightmarish evolution of technology from the days of old. Book 4 also ties Nemesis in with another 2000 AD series by Mills and O'Neill, the ABC Warriors, with a side plot focusing on the leader of that group, Hammerstein, and his current whereabouts in the far future of Nemesis' time, with the two later crossing paths and teaming up to reunite the Warriors. Their incorporation isn't all the best handled, as the story assumes the reader is already familiar with the Warriors and have read their issues up to this point, which very well may have been the case back then, sure, with much of the second half of the book focusing on plotlines and character arcs of the team. While in a vacuum it's not terrible, it's still understandable to someone not versed in the team, but because it's so heavily focused on them, it becomes detrimental to someone only reading Nemesis' issues. This book, and Nemesis as a whole, was always intended as a spin-off of ABC Warriors, but the decision to establish Nemesis on his own up to now makes the inclusion now jarring. But the conclusion to the book has some heavy weight to it. A satisfying and meaty climax packed with action, and things are left off on a wonderful ending, albeit not the happiest. As a whole, Nemesis is an absolutely fantastic read from start to finish. While it has its ups and downs in quality, as any ongoing series does, it maintains a consistent level throughout. The art is drop-dead gorgeous. The characters, few in number though they are fascinating and feel very complex, and a fantastical and rich universe is built in an organic fashion. Nemesis is absolutely worth your attention, and I cannot recommend it more than I already have. Nemesis ran for 10 books total over the pages of 2000 AD, all of which are compiled in a 3-volume collection. A smaller condensed collection with colorized artwork also exists, although I don't recommend it as much. Not that the coloration is bad, by all means it's amazing, I just prefer the black and white. That's going to wrap it up for me for this time. I shall be back sometime soon with more odd and overlooked comics. But for now, remember, if at first you don't succeed, just go back to bed for a while.